like. I'm going to go over a few of the basic features here of Crowdcast. So you can see there is a chat feature. On the right hand of the screen is a little toolbar, and there's some chat bubbles. You click on that, and you can chat and say hello. If you want to ask a question of any of our panelists throughout the event, there is an Ask a Question, a Q&A feature just below the chat bubble. Click on that question mark and put your question in there. That way it'll keep it separate from the chat. Also, if you don't have a question, you can still look at what questions that people have posted, and you can upvote for ones that you like, that you want me to ask. I didn't do any polls today. There's a poll feature there, but I didn't do any of that. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see it says Get You Book. That's a typo. Get Your Book. Click on that, and that takes you to a landing page where each of our panelists' books are up on that landing page. It gives you a synopsis of the book. And if you want to purchase the book, it links it to bookshop.org. We like to promote bookshop.org because they give a percentage of their sales to independent bookstores, and it helps promote independent bookstores. Also, I want to say thank you to all of you for attending, but also thank you to everyone who did contribute. This is a free event, but we do accept $5 contributions, and we really appreciate that because that helps us pay for this platform and continue to host more of these. We had planned to have 4 panelists tonight, but right now we're without Patricia Bernstein, which is unfortunate. She's a history through fiction author. She has a new book, A Noble Cunning, The Countess in the Tower, came out on March 7th. And we're really excited about that. And I was hoping to talk to her about it, but she had some technical issues. She's going to keep trying to get on, so hopefully she's able to do that. But for now, let me bring on our panelists. Okay, tonight we have Stephanie Thornton, author of Her Lost Words. We have Edie Cay, author of A Viscount's Vengeance. And we have Erika Robuck, author of Sisters of Night and Fog. And I have to admit that when I invited Erika to join us, I thought her book was coming out this month. It actually came out a year ago this month. But she's got a great book, and I'm so glad that she could join us. So without further ado, Stephanie, if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your book.
Absolutely. So I'm Stephanie Thornton, and I'm the author of a number of books about women throughout history. I'm also a history teacher and librarian, so history and books are my jam. Her Lost Words is my book that is coming out next week. So that's the one I'm going to talk about today. And that one it's a mother-daughter story, which that theme is very near and dear to my heart. I lost my mom when I was 12 years old, and I have a daughter who's 16, so kind of smack dab in the middle of lots of stuff. And this is the story of Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein, and her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. And this is not a spoiler because it's right in front and center, but Mary Wollstonecraft died just a few days after giving birth to Mary Shelley. So it's both of their lives, but Mary Shelley also trying to connect with her mom, who she never knew. And of course, these are 2 amazing writers, not only the mother of science fiction and Frankenstein with Mary Shelley, but Mary Wollstonecraft is considered the first modern feminist because she wrote The Vindication of Rights of Woman, which is the cornerstone of modern feminism. And they both wrote so much more. So I love both of them.
Thank you, Stephanie. Next, let's hear from Erika Robuck, author of Sisters of Night and Fog.
Yeah, so I also write historical fiction about women and people in the shadows of history. It tends to be women. I call myself an amateur historian, and I'm also a teacher of faith formation, and I've been writing my whole life. But Sisters of Night and Fog is set during World War II, and it's a true story of 2 real remarkable women and how their stories intersect in one of the darkest places and times in history. But ultimately, it is a story of triumph because their staggering courage is astonishing. I couldn't have made it up.
Wonderful. Well, we look forward to hearing more about it. Next, we have Edie Cay. If you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your book.
Yes, hi guys. So my most recent is A Viscount's Vengeance. It is number 4 in a series about women's boxing. So it is set in the Regency era in London. So 1818 is the beginning of the series with the first one. So I'm going to show you this one because I love the cover of it. And then it goes to The Boxer and the Blacksmith in 1819, female boxer and a blacksmith. Then the third one, A Lady's Finder, which I'm so proud to say that it's currently a finalist for a Lambda Award. This takes place in Regency Gay Clubs, which is where I spent my 20s in Anchorage at Mad Myrna's. And then A Viscount's Vengeance is book number 4, also has boxing in it. And then there will be a 5th one next year that will round it all out. But I primarily write about women's boxing and the history of it. It's one of those things that when I found it, I couldn't stop reading about it, couldn't stop researching. So
Thank you, Edie. Yeah, I had Edie on the podcast, and we had a good conversation. I see several people in the chat are mentioning some sound issues. I sincerely apologize. I'm not sure what's going on there. And yeah, you can try logging out, logging back in, maybe trying headphones, something like that. But the sound quality is good here for me. Hopefully it's good for most of you. So again, I apologize if you're having some trouble hearing. This will be available on replay here on Crowdcast, and I will also download it and upload it to our YouTube channel later. Well, let's go back to Stephanie. You write about Mary Shelley and well, both Mary Shelleys. Well, that's not right. But anyways, can you tell us a little bit more about the historical context of these two writers, and what was it about the circumstances that kind of propelled them to become writers and to fight for certain rights that weren't available to women at that time?
Yeah, absolutely. So starting with Mary Wollstonecraft, she is considered one of the writers on the tail end of the Enlightenment, and she also overlaps with the French Revolution. So this was a time period when there was just a lot of turmoil and thoughts and discussions about like rights and independence. And she's at the tail end, so she's a beneficiary of folks like Voltaire and John Locke and Rousseau, saying like we need to open this up as far as like educating the populace, and people have rights and we don't just have to listen to a monarch. And she was like, yes, and excuse me, you're also neglecting to mention 50% of the population. Women would also like to be educated. So we're meant to be more than just arm candy and mothers. And like, do you want an educated populace for your sons as well? Like, then you should start with educating women as well. So her initial books were actually about the education of women. And then she also took on Edmund Burke, who was a member of parliament at the time, with the Vindication of Rights of Man, which was, he had postulated that people should be grateful, the lower classes should be grateful for what they got. And she was like, and then from there went on to write Vindication of Rights of Woman, went to revolutionary France, was there when King Louis went to the guillotine, walked through Versailles when it was deserted. And like her account, she ended up writing a history of the French Revolution, which she was sending back in pieces to England to be published. So she was very much a product of her times, but also very much ahead of her time, because the idea of educating women was seen as so ludicrous and so revolutionary that there was a lot of vitriol that was tossed her way. Plus, she also operated outside of some normal societal rules. So, for example, she had a daughter out of wedlock, and she said, "Why would I get married? Because getting married is just basically the equal to enslaving myself. So why would I do that?" So she ends up being very independent and very forward thinking. And then she has Mary Shelley, and Mary Shelley is also a product of her times, but in a very different way, because she takes up at a young age, she's a teenager really, with Percy Shelley, who she ends up marrying. They elope. That, I don't think that's a spoiler. It comes very fast in the book, and I think most people know that. But she was madly in love with him, and he's a romantic poet. And he also ends up being friends with Lord Byron, uh, who I could talk a lot about him, but we'll just put him on the back burner for now, where he belongs. And the story of the famous, not really dare, but like story competition when they're on Lake Geneva in Switzerland, and it's this ridiculous weather, and they're trapped essentially in Byron's villa while a storm is raging outside. And let's write scary stories. Well, the guys don't end up completing their scary stories, but Mary Shelley ends up writing Frankenstein. Uh, and then rewriting it later on, and then writing so much more. So part of that, I think, was her trying to connect with her mom, but also the fact that she was surrounded by all of these words. Her mother and her father were writers. Her husband is a writer. Their people are writers. And she's also revolutionary because she starts science fiction / horror. It's a little bit of both. With a book that endures to this day and still makes people stop and scratch their heads and think, and like these big huge themes of science and what we should be in charge of and how much humans should actually create. And yeah, so they're both amazing women, amazing writers, and both ahead of their time.
Yeah, and what you just said kind of makes me think about what's going on with our technological revolution right now with artificial intelligence, and like how, where do you draw the line and those sorts of things. So
Yes.
yeah, that brings up a lot of really important topics, and two, just what you mentioned about the rights of women, and you think this wasn't that long ago. I'm sure maybe you went doing your research, you were kind of surprised that it wasn't that long ago when it must have been kind of startling for you.
Yes and no. As a history teacher, like I'm just used to, and having written quite a few books about women who've been overlooked or maligned because they were just women trying to get the job done, be in charge of something. It's a pretty common theme that women get overlooked, pushed aside, discounted. So it wasn't that long ago. The late 1700s, early 1800s, depending on which Mary you're looking at. But even Mary Wollstonecraft writing about these big ideas, well, 200 years later, the second, third waves of feminists, like we're still writing about these same things. So, oh, and I see Kathy's comment. Yeah, same stuff, different century, right? Even if I go back to like my first 4 books are set in the ancient world, there's a lot of really similar themes.
Sure.
Changed that much in some respects, and in some ways it has.
Well, and that's what makes historical fiction so valuable, and what you're doing so valuable. Well, let's go to Erika. Erika, could you tell us a little bit about your main characters, Virginia de Albert Lake and Violet Sabo? Tell us how their stories come together, and when did you know that you wanted to write about them?
Well, I'd written a novel about Virginia Hall, who was a spy from Baltimore. She had a prosthetic leg, and she went on multiple missions behind enemy lines during World War II. And while I was reading about her, all of these other women were coming on my radar who were part of the Office of Strategic Services for the US, or the SOE, Special Operations Executive for Britain. And I kept kind of seeing things about Violet Szabo. And then I would see something about escaped pilots getting out and being put in safe houses. And that's where I found another American named Virginia de Albert Lake. And when I saw their 2 stories, I thought their stories were so big. I thought I'll just write about Virginia de Albert Lake, because her story, she's extremely relatable. She was a teacher, she was a wife, and sort of reluctant to get involved, I think, because she was afraid. So she tried to keep her head down and just, keep quiet, and hopefully this war will just pass her by. But, you can't do that. It eventually, the monster grows so much that you have to step up and do something or get consumed by it. So I kept writing her story, but I kept having these dreams about Violet Szabo. Violet was the polar opposite of Virginia. She was always looking for trouble. She was really feisty. It was her against the world. She had 5 brothers. She was riding motorcycles and climbing trees and shooting guns, and just absolutely desperate to get involved when the war came. And she lived in Great Britain at the time, but she'd grown up in France, so she was back and forth. But her story, I don't want to spoil anything, but it's hard. It's really hard. And what happens to her. And so I just kept kind of saying, I put her off to the side, put her off to the side. But I kept having these dreams about her. And she would come to me and just show me a scene from her life. And I would wake up. One of them, I wrestled a Nazi to the ground and strangled him and watched him die. It was horrifying. And I just woke up like, okay, yeah, I don't want to write that. And then I would keep going with Virginia. And then I would have another dream about Violet. And then finally, I was reading Virginia's diary, and she had written it shortly after the war to try to just exercise everything from her brain. And in it, she mentioned that a woman she'd been arrested with and imprisoned with motivated everybody, encouraged the women to stay healthy and fit and exercise, and was kind of like the cheerleader that kept everybody going. And it was Violet. So their stories did intersect at like the worst possible place, but Virginia spoke so positively about how Violet helped so many women survive. I knew that I had to put the stories together. So that's kind of how I did it. And what happened is it ended up, they were perfect foils for each other, where Virginia is sort of, plays by the rules and slow and steady wins the race. And Violet is just kind of wild and crazy and out there. But the two of them together just show how when people come together, that we all sort of help fill in each other's gaps and motivate each other. And so their stories, it was good to write about them. I see some really nice comments. Thank you.
How much of their personalities did you find like you had to fictionalize, and how much were you able to find through sources and kind of figure out who they were?
Oh, I had so much source material. So I don't write about somebody until I feel like I can crawl in their skin. And between Virginia's diary, the writings of Vera Atkins, who was kind of a spy mistress, eyewitness accounts, interviewing the children of both women, or I've interviewed the child of one and then wasn't in contact with the other till after the book came out. But through all of that, I was able to get a pretty vivid picture of them.
That's really great.
And when you have someone coming to you in a dream saying, write about me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and it kind of goes to show how much background work is necessary for books of historical fiction, and to make sure you get those details right.
Yeah.
Well, Edie, let's go to you. Can you tell us more about the historical context, the historical setting for A Viscount's Vengeance? And I'm also curious, because this is a series, so what do readers need to know about the series before picking your book up?
Actually, very little. I think you can just kind of jump in. So I use my historical information and wrap it on a romance framework. So really the only difference, I think, between a historical romance and historical literary book is that in a romance, you're guaranteed to have a happily ever after. So no matter what, my heroines get to win in the end. So regardless, you can enter in knowing that things are going to work out. So women's boxing, actually the heyday of it was the 1720s. I move a lot of this forward, and I take the different aspects of the best boxer of the 18th century, which was Elizabeth Wilkinson Stokes. Very little has been written about her because she was poor. She didn't have an education, and she disappears from the public record after 1734 when her husband dies. They owned their own amphitheater that boxing took place in. But after his death, I don't know what happened. A lot of her records were lost in the Blitz, actually, the parish that she was born in and belonged to. They don't have those records anymore. So it is a lot of speculation on the various different parts. I have read everything in English about her. There is some supposition that comes up in other languages, but again, everything I know, I've even communicated with the primary scholars on it. I've read the primary documents. I got everything there is to get. Although I'm still convinced that if I can get on the ground in London, I might be able to come up with a couple more places that they might have some documents somewhere hidden in. But I take a lot of these different aspects and I put them in the different characters. So in my latest one, A Viscount's Vengeance, Pearl is the younger sister of a boxer who is a man who was a stockbroker now. He was a prize fighter and then turned stockbroker. This is actually based on an MP who was a real guy. He started out as a boxing career, came from nowhere, basically used the money that he won from his boxing career to gamble, and then eventually won enough money that he had a respectable wife, had a respectable family, and became an MP. So you could make that transition. That was happening. And so he is the hero of book 1. So this is now book 4, and the younger sister who takes on the historical aspects. So she is basically the quiet history nerd, if you want to put it that way, of the series. That's sort of her characteristic. So she has all of the historical aspects of Elizabeth Wilkinson Stokes that I couldn't put in the other books. So she is small. Elizabeth was described as a small and agile English woman. That's the only physical description that we have of her. Yay, Kathy! Yeah, shout out to Quiet History Nerds! Woo! She also dresses as Elizabeth does in a couple of her fights, where they have little short jackets and short skirts. And by short, I mean it's like calf length. They wear pumps and white woolen stockings. And that was actually put in an advertisement to show that this was not some sort of prostitution show, that this was actually female athletes in a competition. And in the 1720s, when Elizabeth fought, she fought and won purses bigger than the males who were fighting in that same cohort. So they were the headlining fight. By the time we get to the Regency, historically, boxing has changed completely, even for the men. Everything is different. And the purses are so much smaller for men and for women. And women end up fighting for like a pint of gin and 5 pounds. That's what they end up fighting for. That's what they win. I mean, this was also during the gin craze. So if anybody is aware of how that works in Regency England, the gin craze was basically tariffs on alcohol were incredibly high, but there was no tariff on gin. So you could make it anywhere and there was no regulation on it. So people would just make bathtub gin and sell it around. And most of the people who did this were women, primarily because you didn't have to have a business license to do so. So women who, were widows, or men who'd left them, or something, that this is a way that they could make real money. But that also means that it was completely unregulated, and some of it was incredibly poisonous. But this is the milieu that I'm writing about, and I write about poor people mostly. Most of my books have the aspect of the poor, and I say that I write about relatable misfits, because I'm not writing about the dukes and the pretty people. I'm writing about the fringes for the most part. So.
And I have to admit, before having Edie on the podcast, I knew nothing of women's boxing at any point in time, to be honest, certainly not in the 1700s. I want to ask you more about that, Edie, but we'll get back to you. I'm trying to get Patricia on. I was just texting with her. So yeah, I don't know what's going on. Her thing is just spinning. So unfortunately, she's not able to join the stage. But let me just say a few things about her book, because I published it and I have read it many times. So we do have a bit of a theme here going as far as Women's History Month. And so her book is about, the main character is Beth Ann Glenn Taggart, and she is based on a real person named Winifred Herbert Maxwell. And Winifred was a Scottish noblewoman, and she was also Catholic. And at the time, in the late 1600s, early 1700s, there's lots of persecution against Catholics. And also, there was an issue over the right to the English throne. I honestly can't remember which. So there was a German king on the throne. He was Protestant, and so a group of Catholics got together, and they wanted to get the rightful heir to the throne, who was a Catholic, James Stuart, who was living in exile in France. They wanted him to get on the throne, so they formed a military. They were called the Jacobites, and they attacked the British army. They were defeated. Among them was Winifred Maxwell's husband, William Maxwell, and he was captured and sent to the Tower of London. where he was sentenced to death for treason. Well, Winifred didn't like this very much, and of course, in the novel, it's Beth Ann, and so she travels south to London through one of the worst snowstorms in history, and she then plots together with some of her women friends to get her husband out of the Tower of London. And this is based on a true story of her trying to rescue William, her husband, or in the book, Gavin, from the Tower of London. I won't say what happens, but it's an incredible story. It's an incredible history. And Patricia does such a great job of bringing it to life, of sharing a lot of true history about Catholic persecution, about the Jacobite uprising at that time. And so it's really fascinating history for me, and it's really well written, and it brings out this great, incredible story about this heroic woman and her friends that did something really amazing. So yeah, that's available now on Noble Cunning. Hopefully readers are interested in that. And I'm very sorry again that we're not able to get Patricia on the stage so that she can talk about it, because she would be much more eloquent talking about it. Reminder, we do have an Ask Q&A feature there. So if any of you have questions for our panelists, just hit that Q&A and enter your question in there, and we can get to that later. For now, let's go back to Stephanie. Stephanie, I want to ask you a similar question to what I asked Erika, and as far as getting to know Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley, what was it like doing your research, and how well do you feel like you got to know these women?
Well, I lucked out because compared to especially the women I wrote about from the ancient world in my first 4 books, Mary Shelley and Mary Wollstonecraft wrote a lot. So we have a lot of their words. Mary Wollstonecraft's letters to one of her romantic interests have all been compiled actually during her lifetime. So letters to Imlay. So there was a lot of opportunity to get a number of emotions and events. And sometimes I get asked, well, why don't you just write nonfiction? If you're going to do all this research, like Erika mentioned, sometimes I feel like an amateur or like a secondary historian. But historical fiction, you're able to bring those things to life, but that requires getting inside your characters' heads and figuring out their motivations and their emotions, and having access to Mary Wollstonecraft's letters, her travel logs, because she travels extensively throughout Scandinavia. And then the same thing with Mary Shelley. We have not only their works of fiction, but like Mary Shelley writes a ton of stuff that people don't even necessarily realize. So multiple other novels, short stories, there's poetry. So I was able to, I would say, as much as possible, get inside their heads. I also lucked out. I went to Italy last year, and in Rome, there is the Keats Shelley Museum, which is this amazing little hole in the wall museum at the base of the Spanish Steps. And it's just chock full of letters from Percy Shelley to Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, Lord Byron. There's references to Mary Wollstonecraft, their letters in their own handwriting, and they're just on the walls for everyone to see and read. So that's one of my favorite things as a historical fiction writer, is being able to trace their steps, which inadvertently is also, or not inadvertently really, but is one of the themes of Mary Shelley's life, and therefore the sections of her lost words, because she didn't know her mother. And once she comes of age, she wants to know her mother, as she becomes a mother herself. Like, there's this void, this piece that's missing. So she travels to the places that her mom went to, and reads her books and reads as much as she can that her mom wrote. So being able to do that as someone who was also writing her, I felt was really powerful as well.
Did you have any trouble transcribing any of the letters, or have all of them been transcribed?
They've all been transcribed. Her handwriting is actually much easier to read than, say, Alice Roosevelt, who I also wrote about, who, when I went to the Library of Congress to read her collection of letters and her diaries, the librarian from the Library of Congress delivered the boxes and said, good luck. I was like, I don't know what that means. And then as I was going through them, I was like, now I know what that means. I have no idea what this says. So Mary Shelley's was easy, which you would expect it to be the opposite, but
Yeah, you kind of have to get familiar with their style of writing. It can be very daunting sometimes.
yeah, Alice Roosevelt's like take a word and then just stretch it out and flatten it until it's just that was her handwriting. It was rough.
Well, Erika, can you tell us a little bit more about the history in your book? We've come to know these women a little bit, but what was the Ravensbrück concentration camp? Because I had never heard of it until I came across your book. Yeah, what is it exactly, and why is it important to learn about it?
Yeah, and it was something that we talked about, my editor and I, and we decided to include that the women end up at Ravensbrück, on the back cover because sometimes people don't want to read a book that gets to a concentration camp. I didn't want to write a book that got to a concentration camp. It's like I can't assure people that there's a happy ending for everybody. And so I feel like I need to just say, look, this is going to get really dark. But so Hitler had made a decree, and he called it the Night and Fog Decree, where he wanted to make so-called enemies of Germany disappear. And that's what started all the concentration camps. Ravensbrück was started for women resistors primarily. So 80% of the women that were there were spies, worked in resistance networks. And then there were then of course there were a lot of Jewish women. There were Roma, people that were criminals. So they took women out of prisons, put them in there. And then people who were considered asocial, whoever Hitler deemed less than was put there. And there were also a number of children. There were about 800 children that went through the camp. Many women who actually became pregnant while they were at the camp because there were forced brothels or where you could work in a brothel in exchange for food. There were a lot of forced abortions at the camp, but there were babies born there. And of the 800 children who lived there, many of them, Patricia's on. Many of them, many of them died of starvation. So it was just a brutal place. It was just a true circle of hell. And I hadn't really heard about it until Martha Hall Kelly's novel, The Lilac Girls, which is just a tremendous novel. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And then when I was researching The Invisible Woman, reading about Vera Atkins, the spy mistress, when the war was over, she went deep into Germany to try to find every one of her women who went missing, or to interview the prison guards or the police, anybody that she could get her hands on, and was able to get most of their stories. And a lot of those men and women were prosecuted in the Nuremberg trials because of Vera Atkins' work. But Ravensbrück was built for about 6,000 people, and at the war's end, there were 50,000 there. And they think about 50,000 women died there. And there were 34 subcamps all throughout Germany. So just the machinery of death at that place. And then to have all of those women there. And we have photographs, we have diaries, drawings. So it's important not to forget that. So it's awful. I told my editor I cannot write a concentration camp book, but when the women's stories converge, we have to go there. So during the writing process, what I did, it actually lined up with November, which is a lot of writers use NaNoWriMo to finish books or to write books. And I came to this writing cottage. I barely ate. I wanted to feel hungry. I didn't sleep that much. And I pretty much wrote those sections in 2 weeks of misery. And I told my family, like, I have 3 boys. One of them's away at college, but I just said, look, guys, I need like 2 weeks where I can't really operate in a normal way, because to go to that place required me to kind of do that. But then I got out and off we went. So it's just important to remember it, but also to honor the courage. So it's not all misery, because the way that they kept a hold on hope, the way they helped each other, the brute strength that they had. I mean, Virginia de Albert Lake was 85 pounds when the camp was liberated. She's a 135-pound woman. She lost so much of her body weight, and yet she lived and she thrived. She didn't live and then, fall away into misery. She really wrote everything down, put it aside, and she moved on. And so it was a story of triumph ultimately for a lot of the women there.
I think that's a great reminder that there is triumph in that tragedy, and yeah, I can't imagine just how awful it was to be there, but then how challenging it was for you just to go through those sources day after day. So we're all very glad that you're able to bring that out, because I work in a social studies history class, and we talk about World War II. I never
Mhm.
came across that history, so it's important that
Yeah. Yeah.
people like you are writing about it.
Well, thank you. Mhm.
Well, Patricia is here. Yay, Patricia.
Oh, I had to I finally
Okay.
got,
So
but
you're
I've
on.
been remarkable. And I mean, it'd be hard to say which of these stories is the most interesting. It's just, they all sound fascinating.
Well, thank you, Patricia. Why don't you? I already tried to say a little bit about your book. Obviously, I didn't do the greatest job. So why don't you tell us a little bit about it and why you wrote about Winifred Maxwell?
Well, I have to say first that I give great credit to Erika, because I've been to Auschwitz and read a lot of books before I went, and decided that was something I never wanted to write about. So all credit to you for your courage, Erika. Um, a Noble Cunning, I think Colin sort of outlined this already. It's based on a true story of a woman who did actually rescue her husband from the Tower of London the night before his scheduled execution. And it was a feat that was never repeated by anybody else. She's the only one who's done that. And it ended up being a very elaborate plot. And two things I loved about it were that it was completely nonviolent, and that she did it entirely with the help of her women friends. But it has to do, I think Colin already outlined that, with the long period of time, over 200 years, when Catholics were really brutally persecuted in Britain. And it didn't start right after Henry VIII ended all contact with the Pope and made himself the head of the Church of England. The hatred of Catholics didn't start immediately. I think it really began to bubble up with Bloody Mary, Mary I, older sister of Elizabeth, who burned at the stake about 300, what she called them heretics, but they were Protestants, including the Archbishop of Canterbury. And then, of course, it was all bound up with the struggle with France and Spain, also, that were very aggressively Catholic nations. And the Brits were always afraid of being invaded by one of those countries, and everybody forced to go back to Roman Catholicism. And then, of course, the Guy Fawkes plot didn't help, when a group of Catholics tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament with the King, James I, in it. And that is, to this day, a big holiday in the fall in Britain. I think you saw a Guy Fawkes holiday scene in The Crown. If anybody's been watching the Crown series, where the Prince of Wales at that time, Charles and Camilla, attended this big bonfire celebration. But the result was that the Catholics were allowed to be there, to be in England, and to be Catholic, but it was essentially in name only, because to have a priest was illegal. You couldn't celebrate a mass. You couldn't even own a rosary. You weren't allowed to buy land or to vote or to hold public office. And everybody was required to attend Church of England services or to pay a fine. And that's only part of it. I mean, there were a lot of other negative laws that were involved too. And Winifred Maxwell, who was the real life heroine, her family were nobility, of a very high station, but they suffered terrible persecution and oppression. Both her parents spent time in the Tower of London on the basis of specious charges that they were plotting against the country or plotting against the king or something of that nature. It was all untrue. They were all loyal members of society, but they were treated as traitors in their own country. So I do want to say, though, Colin, that when there was the Jacobite uprising, it wasn't just Catholics. There were a lot of non-Catholics who didn't like the idea of having a German king foisted on them after Queen Anne died, just because he was the only Protestant they could find. They skipped over 50 closer relatives to find a Protestant. And he was a pretty unattractive, unprepossessing character anyway. Just to give you an idea, his wife called him Pig Snout behind his back, of course. And he ended up disposing of her in a very sordid way. So when he arrived in London for his coronation, he brought with him these two mistresses, and one was very tall and emaciated, and she was referred to as the maypole or the scarecrow, and the other one was called the elephant. So you can imagine what she looked like. And of course, the pamphleteers and cartoonists of the time had a wonderful time lampooning this ridiculous man with his ridiculous mistresses. And he didn't even speak English, basically. So the Jacobites hoped to depose him and put a Catholic and a real Englishman, even though he'd been raised in exile, on the throne instead. And then, of course, the Catholics hoped that would end persecution of Catholics. But I think the plan was that if that had succeeded, James Stewart wasn't going to try to make everybody turn Catholic again. His father had already tried to give them religious tolerance, and he was supposed to do that too. So it was a very difficult time for them. And I was just astounded that I had never heard this story before. We heard it when we were touring Traquair House in Scotland, beautiful grand old house. And we paused before the portraits of Winifred and her husband, William. And the guide told me the story, and I just couldn't get it out of my mind. And I might as well go ahead and say, Colin, I had only published nonfiction books up to that point, hadn't really planned on writing fiction. But one of her descendants had written a lovely biography that was very comprehensive. So I didn't see a need to do that again, but it seemed to be a story that just cried out for dramatizing. And that's why I decided to turn my hand to fiction and see what I could do with it. And I hope I've done it justice. I mean, it's just too good a story to do a slapdash job. So I spent about 5 years on it, all kinds of deep research. Anyway, thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you're able to join us, and you shared so much fascinating history there. I know Edie already mentioned a tie-in with her book, and I see some comments about some other parts of that history. I will recommend anyone interested in hearing more about Patricia's deep dive in history. Her blog on patriciabernstein.com goes into detail on a lot of those things. But the book, as you mentioned in our podcast, was 800 pages long to begin, and you narrowed it down to just the story of Winifred trying to rescue in her husband, and I think you did that nicely. Let's go back to Edie. We're getting kind of short on time, and I do want to ask some of the questions from the audience, but I did want to ask you about Paper Lantern Writers, because I think this is a really valuable place for independent authors, and I don't know if it's been done in other genres, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about what it is and how it works.
Sure. So Paper Lantern Writers is an author collective focused on marketing. So it started out with 5 of us, and it's based actually on Tall Poppies. Tall Poppies was the first one that kind of really took off, where it's an organization of authors basically trying to lift each other up to gain visibility, and people who either self-publish or are with indie presses like History Through Fiction, they don't have that reach the way HarperCollins might, or Penguin, something like that. So we banded together. We've been going, this is our third year, yes. Well, kind of fourth. We had a little bit of prep time, and then we launched full of stars and hearts in 2020. And then of course the pandemic hit, and we all had to refigure out how things were going to work. But last year we did publish our first anthology, Unlocked. So 8 of our members put stories in here, and right now we are at 16 members. We've added members every year. Our focus is historical fiction. I don't believe Tall Poppies has a focus in terms of what kind of authors they have. I believe it's women's fiction, but I'm not 100% on that. And so basically what we do is we have a blog. We blog twice a week. We have a once a month program on YouTube where I interview authors. So I've interviewed Lisa C. I got Kate Quinn coming on in July, Reese Bowen, Eva Lee, Vanessa Riley. Just had some really amazing talks with people. Amelie Howard, she's got some amazing books out too. So we've all banded together doing all these different sorts of things. And we have a Facebook group called Shine, where you can get a hold of us if you want to join. And basically, we just talk about historical fiction there in all the different ways. And yeah, it's great. It's fantastic. And it's a great way to also find more books. So I'm reading a whole bunch of books from our newest members that just joined a couple months ago. So I'm reading A Girl with a Knife, which is by Alina Rubin, which is also set in 1800s England. And Patricia, I'm sorry, while you were talking, there were so many points where I was like, oh yeah, and then oh yeah, because our histories are in the same point. So yeah, there were so many points of that history where I was like, oh yeah, and then also this part too. So because I also deal with a lot of the English history. So Girl with a Knife is really fantastic about a woman who dresses up as a man to attend medical school, which is kind of fun. There's another one coming out by Jonathan Posner, which is a time travel into Elizabethan Tudor time periods, kind of a swashbuckling sort of story. There's Michael Ross. I'm going to read his latest one, which is set in the US, basically the expansion into post-Civil War and the expansion west. So it's just a great way to learn all of these different aspects that I might not look into otherwise. I might not have heard of them otherwise. So it's fantastic. I can't say enough good things about this program that we've built, group. We've become great friends too, on top of it. So
Yeah, that's really great. And you launched it in 2020. I know that must have been challenging, but it's definitely growing. I'm glad. I mean, I started Histories of Fiction in 2019. I'm glad I found you guys as like a partner. I did read Linda Uliset's book, A River Remembers, and reviewed that. I had Alina Rubin on the podcast. So yeah, it's a great way to connect. If you love historical fiction, definitely check out Paper Lantern Writers.
yeah,
well, we've got. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I just wanted to plug one more time the anthology, because it's really unusual. And it's also only $2.99, so it's really easy to pick up. But I'm really proud of it because it is short stories that all of us have written that are interconnected, and it takes you back in time. So it starts in the 1970s in Berkeley and ends on the winter solstice in Ireland in 1225. And I just think it's a really lovely thread that goes through. So
yeah,
that's all. Okay, I'll shut up now.
No, thanks. Thank you, Edie. We have a couple questions about research. Nancy asks about, like, how do you decide when to stop doing research? And then in the chat, we have Spencer asking about how do you organize your research? So, any of you can jump in, but let's start with you, Stephanie. What are your thoughts on organizing your research and when to stop and when to continue?
I don't have a system necessarily as far as like a program. When I initially start, I try to read a biography because I write biographical historical fiction. And then it just turns into this mountain of papers and research. I will read as much as I possibly can, and I tend to go from broad to more narrow. So it depends on what I feel the manuscript needs and what's available. So with Her Lost Words, I was able, as I mentioned, to pick up copies of Mary Wollstonecraft's works and her letters, and also Mary Shelley's. When I wrote, and they called it Camelot, about Jackie Kennedy, I had the opposite issue of there's so much written about the Kennedys. What did I need? Well, towards the end, I was like, I really need to buff up her relationship with her sister Lee. Well, there's a book for that. So there's so many resources out there, be it a biography, some primary sources, or as I mentioned before, walking in the person's footsteps. If able to travel, pandemics excluded, I will make it a point to get to where my protagonists lived and walked and saw things, because that really adds a whole new level of authenticity. So when it comes to organizing, I would love to say I have this beautiful system. There's a lot of post-it notes around my house. Usually I can decipher most of what I've written on them. But there's just a lot of books that I've marked up and a lot of notebooks and post-it notes, and it all ends up working out in the end. So that's my system or non-system.
Erika, what are your thoughts? Do you have any organizational methods for all your research?
Yeah, I keep notebooks for each of the books that I write. So I'm always taking notes, whether I'm watching a documentary, going to an archive, and then I have corresponding folders that go with it, physical folders. And I take tons and tons of photographs. Like Stephanie, if I'm able to go somewhere, I do so. And then on my computer in my bookmarks, I keep everything associated with that time period. So I can easily grab whatever I need. Whenever I have a downtime, or when I'm not actively writing, I go through my notebooks and I'll highlight the names so I can just easily reference it. And then I kind of write myself notes in the margin about, this is what I would say. Here's the research. Here's how the scene, I'll write scene. So that's kind of how it's worked out to me. And also like Stephanie, I start broad and then I narrow the focus until I try to finish before I start writing by reading anything that's primary. So a diary, a letter, anything like that, so I can get into the head of the person.
Patricia, I think you might be able to speak a little bit to when did you finally decide to stop doing research and start writing your novel? Was that difficult for you?
I adore the research. That's dessert for me. And I really find that I have to work very hard to know when to not follow this rabbit trail to the end, because I'm not going to use that much of it. And I have to get on to another subject because it's all so fascinating. You guys sound so organized. I've got like folders and folders and folders and legal pads covered with notes and and books, highlighted and stuff. I wish I were more organized about it. And then what I end up doing so often is not going back to all those notes, but taking the primary ideas that I remember from studying that particular element. Right now, I'm in the Third Crusade. I'm up over my head in the Third Crusade for the thing that I'm working on now, and the Great Massacre that Richard I ordered after they took the fortress of Acre, or Acre, however you say it. And it is hard to stop, I just fall into all of this. It's all so interesting. You want to know more and more and more. And it's hard to just say, okay, I know enough about that. That's not going to be that important. I need to go on to something else.
Yeah, it's you can get caught up in all that and end up on a whole new subject if you're not careful. Edie, what are your thoughts on research?
I actually have the opposite problem than anybody else does. I don't have that much information about women's boxing. So I researched my time period quite a bit. What I do, I actually took this page. So my father-in-law is a physicist, and I took his I took his way of organizing his photographs, because he's a physicist and so he is extremely organized. And I have a process where I read my books. I usually get 4 or 5 for each new book. For the beginning, it was just basically just about women's boxing and about the Regency time period. So, 1800s. I believe that you need to research the time period just before, as well as your own time period, like the generation before. So if you're going to write about 1815, you need to know what happened in 1790, because that's when your characters are born, right? And I live in 2023, but I am formed because of my Generation Xness. I am formed by the fact that I didn't have a computer growing up, and I used phones that were connected to a wall. And, these are the things that I know, and that informs how I view the world. So even things about this changing styles of underwear, I researched that for my second book, The Boxer and the Blacksmith, because as a female boxer, how she is binding herself is, what kind of stays does she wear? Because I know stays changed at the turn of the 1800s, but as a woman who is not going to be concerned about fashion, what would she be wearing? And she's poor on top of it. So how is that going to inform what she's going to do? So I am very much into that. I highlight things, I tag it as I read. And then when I'm in a lull where I'm like, oh, I want to keep researching, but I don't want to write yet. So then I open up a spreadsheet. I type in what I have highlighted, because that also puts that information back in my head. So I have that, right? So I can also start to filter like, oh, that is actually not as important as I thought it was when I highlighted it. And I cite which book it came from, which page number it came from, just in case I want to look around at the paragraph surrounding it. Do I need more context for whatever that information came from? And of course, I lock my rows so that then it is searchable. So I can look into my Finder and say, oh, what was that thing? I know it was in this book, and it was something about, I don't know, about the way they shaped a nail head in blacksmithing. And so then I can put like nail head into my search bar, and then it'll go straight to all the quotes that are from that. And it makes it a lot easier for me to reference myself, because I tried it with books that I haven't published. My research, which is more like Stephanie's and Erika's, where I have notebooks that I've handwritten and I have Post-it notes everywhere, and I end up losing all of that. So with this series, I tried really hard to just organize it. And it's become very helpful as well, because I have now taken to speaking on the history of women's boxing and doing presentations. And so it's really lovely to be able to say, oh, hey, this is the picture, because I spent 5 hours on Wikimedia looking at pictures, from satiric cartoons from the 1800s, trying to figure out what a woman's boxer would look like, because there was nothing in a famous painting about it. So what can I find in cartoons? So that's how I do it. It is not for everybody, but it's what I find helpful.
It sounds pretty clever to me. I know I can speak to having notebooks filled with notes and you're just paging through. I know I wrote this somewhere and you can't find it. So
Yeah, I
really
mean, I take notes from the guy who works for NASA. That's what I can do. He's way smarter than me. So.
Well, the hour has gone quick. I do have one more question I want to ask each of you. But first, before I do, I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to remind you that you can purchase these books if you click on that link, get your book, and that'll take you to a landing page. You can go to bookshop.org and buy them. If you can't afford to purchase books right now, request them from your library, post about these books on social media, anything like that to get the word out about these fantastic books and fantastic authors. I want to say personally, I'm just so grateful to have the opportunity to bring us together like this, because we do, as historical authors, you all do so much work, and most of it is in solitude. And so it's great to see that you can all relate and that you're all doing such great work, and just to be able to talk about it. Well, I always end these things asking about how the value of historical fiction, because history through fiction is all about bringing stories to life, bringing historical narratives to life. And I think that's a very valuable thing. So I want to ask all of you, why did you spend years of your life researching and writing and doing it and fictionalizing it in a way to teach people about history? So Stephanie, let's start with you.
I write stories about women from history because I think we need to shine more spotlights on these forgotten women stories. The reason that I started writing, historical fiction brings history to life. Not everyone is going to sit down and read a history textbook or a nonfiction account of something, but if you can weave in the emotions, I see it with my students all the time. It's the stories. If I get up and tell a story about someone from history, I can blow their minds. But if I just assign a textbook chapter, which I don't know that I've ever done, then it makes it dry and dusty, and that's not history. History is just so amazing and rich and full of so much that we can learn from. So that's why I write historical fiction.
Definitely. Thank you. Erika, what are your thoughts on the value of historical fiction?
Well, my late Irish grandma was a great storyteller and was always giving me books that I was way too young to be reading, slipping me V.C. Andrews and Stephen King when I was like 9, and then we would talk about the books. And so she and I were always, we had like our own little book club. And so she really ingrained this love of story in me. And then her family stories are fascinating. And then when I got to college, I minored in literature, and I was reading Toni Morrison's Beloved, yeah, where your whole life you hear textbook stories about slavery, but then you read a story about a woman who would murder her own child to save the child from the life of torture, and the child coming back to haunt her. I felt that, that made me feel it so much more than a textbook had. And so I want people to feel history so that they can learn from it. And that's what I started seeking out. So Tracy Chevalier, The Girl with the Pearl Earring, just anything like that where I can learn and feel, and then it sends me down a rabbit hole. I love that. I love to be a part of it. So.
Yeah, that's great. Patricia, you had to make a transition, as you said, from nonfiction to fiction. So why do that?
Well, I had been writing narrative nonfiction anyway, and my feeling about that is you can make that very exciting and engrossing also. But when I changed over to fiction for this novel, it was a revelation. I mean, no footnotes. How fantastic is that? And you can change anything you want, which is another fun thing. But as I said in a talk the other day, I'm sure somewhere somebody has written a novel about Charlemagne meeting Jane Austen on some exotic planet. I think it's a lot more fun for me to really try to get as close as I can to recreating what life was really like in that period, and not taking too many liberties, but trying to get inside that character's head and figure out how they lived every day. And that's very exciting to me. And I agree with everybody else that it brings it to life. It's not just a bunch of dates, this battle happened here. And I mean, you can read about the Jacobite Rebellion was 1715, and here's what they didn't like, and they lost, and blah, blah, blah. But if you see characters actually going through this experience, real people who lived through this, that you're dramatizing in fiction, it makes a much stronger impression.
Yeah, and we learn about little details like hot chocolate and what that was used for. Edie, how about you? You get to write some happy endings in your books, so let's see if you can bring us to a happy ending here tonight.
Well, I will say that I started being interested in historical fiction when I was a kid and reading The Witch of Blackbird Pond. That was the first book that made me cry, where I was old enough to feel like I was in the story with her. I've always wanted to write historical fiction because I see historical fiction a lot like science fiction and fantasy, where you build a world and you use that world as a framework to show people themselves, that you reflect the time period, the modern time period you're living in, by showing them the history that you have already lived. For my personal books, because I write about women's boxing, part of the reason why I'm very interested in showing the lives of poor women and women who did things that you wouldn't believe that they did is because there are so many ways that the Victorians, don't get me started, the Victorians erased so much of the history that was messy and sexy and weird and strange, and all the ways that people really just hang themselves out there. And my family is not a family of princes or dukes. We were just the unwashed masses, and that story deserves to be told as well. And it wasn't all misery, and they did live happily ever after, and you can find love, and you can get what you want.
Okay, very well done. Thank you, Edie. Oh, thanks again to our panelists. Thank you, everyone who attended. The replay is available at this same link, this same original link. I'm also going to put it on our YouTube channel, History Through Fiction's YouTube channel. So thanks again to everyone. This is a great conversation. Patricia, I'm so glad that you were able to join us eventually. And have a good night. Thank you.